Hello, guys. It's me again, Aswat. Welcome to another podcast. Where I am right now is Malaysia. It's June 2021. We're still having to deal with the COVID virus, even though if I open the news, America is recovering. But in my country, situations are starting to get worse because we never had like 7,000 per day. Last week we were having like that. The numbers were like high, 5,000, 6,000 a day infection, and then we having started to go for 7,000 a day. So the government enforced another lockdown again, and they're trying to get everybody vaccinated. There are some political issues that happening, and I don't want to go into that. So people trying to get vaccinated. So now the government put a lockdown, so it's put a brake on the number of infection rising, because they put a stop to people going to work, people going to the malls. They put a damper, put a stop to that, and it seems to be working. And some people don't like the lockdown, but I think it's necessary because I take the COVID pandemic very seriously. So it is because I'm in the pandemic, because I'm in the lockdown, the mood to write for this podcast pop up, because it's so moody, so dour. It's raining outside, raining a few days, very gloomy kind of mood. So decided to write about and to talk about horror in movies. And I'm going to just focus on white horror. There's a lot of horror genre, and people tend to look at it like a one kind of genre. But because it's my background to study literature and whatnot, study storytelling, literature from cultures, every kind of horror is related to who wrote it and where it was written and how it was influenced by the culture of when the product is released. So a story was released, was out into the public. So I just want to start with white horror. White horror specifically meaning American Western horror in movies, European, but mostly American. We're gonna start American horror, then which will include European horror as well. You must understand there is always a genre, I would say, within all film genre. I would put it like before the internet and after the internet. Before the internet meaning I would put year 2000, 2015, 2007 and or above or below, because 2007 is the start of the internet revolution. They become very big and people can Google and search movies from other countries. And before 2007 the internet was just beginning, and before 2007 earlier it's difficult to get movies from other countries. The internet was not robust, you cannot browse and whatnot. So much worse if you are in the 90s or in the 80s and the 70s, because then the exposure to horror is only basically within your culture, whether your economic group, state, country and culture, because you don't have the internet. You can't see so much what other countries are producing or making films unless you are really into film. You travel, you go and watch all this international competition. You are always studying films, then you'll be exposed more to other countries' films. So that was before the internet. After the internet, everybody can be a film expert, Everybody can watch any movies from any other countries. You can order it online or watch it online. So it's more open. So a person who writes a horror movie can be influenced by other countries' films and other cultural films. So there is a difference if you really go into how a story is produced. And I want to start with white. I specifically put it white American horror, white Western horror, because white is the dominant race in those Western hemisphere. And if you look in the history of American horror or European horror, most of the horror movies are written by white people, directed by white people. So, and it is a very fascinating way to look at their experience, because it's not written from a black experience, a black cultural experience, even though there is an examples of movies like Candyman or horror from a black cultural perspective, but it's still produced and mass produced by companies that are largely white. And so the 70s and earlier on, horror movies in America, you can you can get the werewolf, the vampires, the universal horror they call it, the sea monsters, and then it goes into the Jaws, animals horror, Bigfoot kind of thing. Also the slasher films like Friday the 13th, Poltergeist and everything. But if you look at those horror that I just mentioned, Stephen King's movies, based on his book. If you look at that from a point of view, they are all white. The horror is very much related to white culture, white perspective, white white point of view. And anything that is written by a perspective like that is influenced by their culture, by their belief system. And I come to this kind of method because I studied literature. I was studying English as a second language, teaching English as a second language, and I managed to study English literature. And then I went into post-colonialism literature, and then I discovered that English literature written by white people and compare that English literature written by a colonized people in English. It's like British imperialism conquered Africa and India, and then when they write about a country, it's different from when Indian writer write about a country, or African writer write about a country in English. And you can see the perspective how the British may look at their time in India as like the best part of the empire, but if you look from a Indian person, it was a horrific part of the history to have a British empire overriding them. And America famously has always been a colonized, but it has never been colonized except by the white people. Usually the white British writers have experienced this. They write a story. I would write a story about their time in India during their colonizing time, during their empire, and how they write about India is different from an Indian writer writing about their time during British colonialism. So there is a lot of, you can see that perspective. The only thing, it might sound weird when I talk about horror movies and horror books, literature, because I'm writing from the white perspective. The white perspective, white films about horror in the genre of horror is basically just from their point of view, from a white cultural point of view. You don't see so much of from a black perspective, except for the recently. We are doing this podcast in 2021. I think recently, just very recent years, you can see movie like Us and You, and black directors starting to emerge in America. So there's a more black voices in films writing about horror and making movies about horror for the first time in such a long time. I'm not saying that there was not a horror movie written by a black person or person of color in America before that, but it was very, 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 it was like very, very small part of the legacy of white horror, of American Western horror movies. So, because they are written by white people during the 60s, 40s, 60s, 70s, and 90s, you can study how white perceive horror and how white people perceive justice, or how they look at monsters or creation of evil, the definition of evil. Because for them, the evil is always a monster, a stalker, children, kids who are breaking, who are trying to go against religion. If you watch a stalker movie is always about punishing the naughty kids. Because if you see a stalker movie like Friday the 13th, Freddy Krueger, people who die in those movies are basically people who are having sex with each other, taking drugs, very douchey people, very rude people. They always end up dying in those movies. And like people who goes against God always die. And there's that 70s stalker, 80s stalker, and so on. It continues that kind of development. So the writing of that is always influenced by white culture, how they look at it, and it is always religion based, most of the time of religion based, and trying to, you can study that kind of instinct. What does white people fear? What does white people scared about? So they're always having that. They are afraid of a serial murder, serial killers, and of course, if you go to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there's a lot of cases of serial killers. So they are also afraid. What they are afraid of? Okay, their portrayal of fear is always cannibalism. Other people aspect of cannibalism, or people who are these tribes, which is non-white people, having cannibalism instinct, zombies and whatnot. Always something like non-white in the Amazon somewhere or anywhere that tend to eat people, the uncultured, uncivilized people. So there's always a fear of that. That's also come from a very Christian-centric point of view, that colonialism point of view, that white people won't do that. White people are the people who are innocent, but the savages are out there. So they call it the savages. And Africans are always victimized. South Americans are always victimized. Any other cultures are always victimized except for white. So that's, you can see that cannibalism playing part of the and also the voodoo, demonic possession, demonic stories always come from the other side, non-white. But it's always the demon, the devil, and whatnot. It's always portrayed by the Caribbean, by the South American, by the voodoo practitioners, witchcraft. This is always by non-white or people who goes against the church and whatnot. So that's how horror developed very strongly during the 60s, 70s, 80s, and it was carry on up to the 90s. You can see the 90s people are starting to get, not I say more woke, but they're starting to open up. What happened during this period, the 70s, 80s, 90s, is that without a doubt, more and more black people are more educated. They are becoming more and more educated. There are more black businesses, more rich black people are popping up in the culture of America. The 80s and the 90s. You cannot avoid it. Rap. You can see the difference between the white horror genre coming to not a standstill, but having to counter with like the rising minorities in those countries. Those are the first time you hear about black people earning more millions. And whereas that was always suppressed until today, it's still suppressed, but they cannot deny that black culture was going up within the music scene, within the sports scenes, and then in education scene, they are more intellectual from the black culture, from the people of color. And because then you can see the American white majority have to deal with that growth, But it was they have to admit it, they have to accept it, but it's still something new for them. And even for the black creative people, meaning black writers, black directors, are still growing up in this period. And then during this period, you can see all these black directors popping up, making movies about the hood and whatnot. Black culture was starting to pop up more on the media. You can see during this time also the Constable, the TV shows about black culture was starting to show, and then the trend of horror at this point, you can see they're starting to change. You can see the less of the what do you call it, the more racial based, like cannibalism topic or voodoo topic, is starting to go down. It's starting to go down, and all is still lingering with the jump scares, and then before the gore horror, gore porn that came up with Saw and whatnot during the late 2000s. But the horror trend in America slowly changed to accept the growth of the black culture. So until I think the recent explosion, like really the country really takes attention with movie like Us, You, it's like black directors making horror movie are starting to pop up in the white American consciousness. Movie like Us, Antebellum, begin to really pop up with the new, like Jordan Peele, like, I mean, I'm not a big fan. I'm not saying that I'm a big fan to bring this up, but when Jordan Peele movie Get Out came out in 2017, you can see somehow the voice of American horror is starting to come up. You can trace the black influence in American horror, has always been there, but very, very subtle movies like Night of the Living Dead. There are black actor in that. Blackula, like I said before, Candyman. But it's very, very Candyman, very, 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 very low key. Tales from the Hood, very, very low key. So most of the black horror, I think, that really highlight that part of the culture is the Get Out. I would say Get Out and 2017, and then movies like More 2019, and then Us also 2019. You can see that Jordan Peele and the group is starting to push for more horror voice. And when you start to write from a black perspective, the difference is really amazing, because then the context is why black people have not been writing horror or making horror movies for all those while, because white black people doesn't have to write a horror movie, because every day they are facing horror. Black oppression of the people who are people of color has always been horrific, more horrific than horror movies. So white people will write about whatever they fear, but they impose the horror on black culture, black people, has always been there. So if you're a black person, you don't need to watch a horror movie to understand horror. You can walk down the street and there will always be a cop following you, or you can get shot by a cop. All the horror element is already there in the black culture for a long time. Even after they're released from slavery, the black culture, black people and people of color, minorities in America has always faced that kind of horror. And when you see Jordan Peele's coming out with his movie, Get Out or Us, you can see the topic of horror for the black director, black writer, has always been oppression. Has come out as a story of how this trauma is creating horror for the black people. They don't need the horror cliche, and because the horror is there, and it's shown, black in the Get Out, how that racism is always the more horrific thing that goes on in around a black person. And then, of course, as we go to 2021, you can see Black Lives Matter, because police can kill any black people so easily. And that is so more horrific than film horror. And the point I'm trying to make is white people need to create horror. Needs to create horror movies. That's the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. It's always about the rise of the white horror movies, because they need to create that kind of horrific things. But if you watch those 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s kind of horror, when white people wrote it, they don't write about, the black experience, oppression. They don't write. It's about always people going up against the church, or anybody who have sex will die in the movies, demonic possession, voodoo, cannibalism, zombie, that kind of approach, because they never see themselves as an oppressor. But when the black people starting to get that post-internet, post-colonial, post-internet openness, where people can watch and compare movies, you can start to see more minority voices in horror movies. And how they write is about oppression, is about what affects their culture. And it is so much horrific than real life. The real life horrors is so much horrific than the horrors created by, white directors or white writers. Because, they don't have to imagine it. They don't have to make it a fantasy. Because the horror that the black culture faces is real. When I start this podcast, I was talking about when white people write about India, white colonizers write about India, is different from when an Indian person writes about India during colonial times. There is so much differences in that kind of perspective that white people doesn't see, because they are the colonizers. But from Indian people, they are being colonized. When they write from that perspective. They can see the horror of that colonialism. Same as when black people start to produce their own writing, start to produce their own movies, horror movies. You can see that what they are facing is that much bigger horror of racism, of cultural divide, cultural gap, and the oppression that goes on in their community, in the black community, black culture. And it is important if you watch this kind of growth, which is like after the internet explosion, where more people can more people can create and openly, like you can do a movie and post it on YouTube. So black culture, black directors, black writers are surging during the 2020s, 2018s. You can see more black writers, black creators coming up, and you can see the perspective from the black culture, the people of color culture, and how they produce that, and how the culture affects their writing. It is quite interesting. So when you realize this, you can see, oh, there is such a difference, and how if you are from a certain level in society, meaning here the white, and then you are the tall, rich, higher up, and then the black people is being oppressed from the down there, being pressed down on their necks, and in the case of George Floyd, being killed while a white officer sitting on the necks. How can that, from that perspective, you can see the horror of it, when the white people who are oppressing it would not have gotten the idea that how the black people are facing if there was not an internet, if there was no video recording of that incident. But for black people, that's normal. They see it every day. So when they see it, they don't need to create a fantasy about horror. The horror is there in their real life. Thank you guys for your time, and that's it. That's my podcast about horror in culture, white horror, white Western horror, and of course the black perspective in horror. Thank you guys for your time. Peace.